The station floated in the dark like a lantern left on a porch. Threshold 9 was one of the oldest diplomatic stations in the Concordat, a wide, spinning ring of metal and glass, full of species who had nothing in common except the need to talk to each other. Ships of every shape docked there every day. Long silver vessels from the Velhari, short, wide transports from the Dokoth, quiet research ships from the Miran Collective, who communicated mostly in color and rarely spoke. Nobody paid much attention to new arrivals anymore. Then the human ship came. It did not arrive quietly. Its engines were loud even in the vacuum, not because they were broken, but because that was simply how human engines sounded. Like something grinding through stone. The ship was large. Not the largest thing ever docked at Threshold 9, but large enough that 3 smaller vessels had to be moved to make room for it. Its hull was dark gray, almost black, and there were marks on it, long scratches, and old burns that had been patched, but never fully painted over. It wore its damage, the way an old soldier wears his scars. Without apology, along the nose of the ship, someone had painted a creature. It had no wings, no legs, nothing recognizable, just a long body, coiled slightly, with a mouth open wide enough to swallow something whole. The teeth were long and white against the dark metal. The name below the painting read, U.E.S. Leviathan. Ambassador Saris Val stood at the observation window and looked at it for a long time. Val was Velhari. His people were tall, thin, and bioluminescent. Soft pulses of blue and green light moved under their skin when they felt things strongly. Right now, the light in his neck was flickering with something close to confusion. He had met humans before. He had read their files. He had prepared himself for their physical appearance, shorter than Velhari, thick-boned, with flat faces and eyes that could only see a narrow band of light. Unremarkable, honestly, by the Concordat's standards. But the ship bothered him. Counselor Thren appeared at his side. Thren was Dokoth, wide and low to the ground, with 4 arms and a head shaped like a smooth river stone. He was the station's head historian, and he was already holding a datapad, which meant he had already started researching something. A Leviathan, Thren said quietly, reading from his pad. It is a creature from early human mythology. A sea beast. Said to live in the deep ocean and destroy ships. They named their warship after something that destroys ships, Val said. Yes. That is not logical. No, Thren agreed. It is not. They watched the Leviathan times finish docking. Clamps locked into place with a sound that carried through the whole station. Then, the airlock opened, and the humans came out. There were 6 of them in the welcome party. They wore dark uniforms, clean and pressed, with small flags stitched onto the shoulder, the blue and white circle of Earth. At the front walked a woman. She was not especially tall. Her skin was deep brown, her hair cut short, and her face had the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from long practice at keeping things inside. She moved like she had walked into unfamiliar rooms 100 times before and had never once been the most worried person in them. This was Commander Nadia Okafor, captain of the Leviathan. Val met her at the end of the docking corridor, with 2 aides behind him and his diplomatic smile in place. He gave the standard Concordat greeting a slow bow, left hand over the chest. Okafor gave it back, almost perfectly. Someone had taught her. She had practiced. Commander Okafor, Val said, welcome to Threshold 9. The Concordat is glad to welcome humanity's newest commissioned vessel. Thank you, Ambassador, she said. Her voice was calm. Not warm, not cold. Simply present. The Leviathan Times is glad to be here. Val walked with her through the corridor toward the diplomatic hall. He made the usual conversation, the length of the journey, the quality of their faster-than-light drive, the standard exchange of pleasantries that every species performed, and none of them truly meant. Okafor answered each question fully and correctly, and without offering anything extra. Then Val asked the question that had been sitting in him since the moment the ship docked. Commander, I hope you will not find this rude, but I must ask about your ship's name. Go ahead, she said. In the Concordat, ships are named after virtues, after stars, after mathematical principles, or founders of great institutions. Even the more warlike species name their vessels after concepts honor, or inevitability, or the name of a god. He paused. Humans name their warships after monsters. Okafor walked 2 more steps before she answered. Because the ocean taught us to, she said. Val waited for more. It did not come. I am afraid I don't fully understand, he said carefully. I know, she said, and she smiled just slightly. Not unkind. Just the smile of someone who knows that an explanation would take longer than the hallway they were walking through. Val logged the exchange that night in his official journal. He described it as times a quaint cultural artifact, poetic, but without real strategic meaning. He noted the painting on the hull, the name, the unusual aesthetic choices of human military culture. He recommended that the Concordat Cultural Department request a full briefing at some later date. Then, he closed the journal and moved on to other things. Counselor Thren did not move on. Thren stayed in his small office for the next 6 hours, reading. He found old Earth records, not military records, not political ones, older than that. Accounts from the time when humans had no ships that could leave their own atmosphere, when their only ocean was the one on their home planet. He read about wooden ships on salt water, about storms that came without warning, about sailors who went out knowing they might not come back, and went anyway, because the fish were on the other side of the water and their families were hungry. He read about the names they gave those ships. The Endurance, the Relentless, the Terror, the Erebus. Some of those ships never came home. Their crews died in ice, or fire, or in water so cold that a man stopped feeling his legs in 4 minutes. And yet more ships went out the next year, with new names, new crews, the same ocean. Thren set down his pad and sat for a while in the quiet. He understood something that Val did not. The name was not arrogance. It was not a boast. It was something much older and much stranger than either of those things. It was a statement. I know what is out there. I know it is bigger than me. I know it has killed people like me before, and I am going anyway. He was still thinking about this when the alert came through on every screen in the station. Red borders. Emergency frequency. A voice broken, desperate from the Keth frontier. 3 days travel from threshold, 9. The Vorkai were attacking again. 3 dreadnoughts, 1 colony. No defenses left standing. Thren stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, in the dock, the Times Leviathan Times sat still and dark and patient, its painted mouth open wide in the vacuum. He thought about sailors. He thought about the ocean. He thought about everything that had ever looked at the sea and decided that the other side was worth the crossing. Then he went to send a message to Sub-Commander Riel, who was already aboard that ship, and who had no idea yet what he had gotten himself into. Space between stars is not empty. It only looks that way. There is radiation, and old dust, and the slow, invisible pull of things too far away to see. And sometimes there are ships, small metal rooms, moving through all of that, nothing at speeds that should be impossible, carrying people who had no business being out there, going somewhere they probably should not go. The Concordat fleet left Threshold, 6 hours after the distress call. 5 ships in total. 4 were Concordat vessels, long, clean, silver-hulled, named after things like times-measured resolve times and times principle of order. The 5th was the Times Leviathan, which was none of those things, and which followed at the back of the formation like a dog that had been told to sit, but was watching the door anyway. Sub-Commander Riel stood in the docking corridor of the Times Leviathan Times and tried to remember how he had ended up here. He was Velhari. He was an observer, that was the official word. The Concordat wanted someone aboard the human vessel to file reports, to assess their tactical capability, to determine whether humanity's newest warship was actually worth the resources the Concordat had spent welcoming them. It was a polite mission. A bureaucratic one. He had done things like it before. None of those other ships had paintings of monsters on the front. A human bumped into him in the corridor, apologized immediately, and kept walking. That was the first thing Riel noticed about the crew. There were a lot of them, and they moved fast, and they were always slightly in each other's way, and none of them seemed to mind. On a Velhari ship, the crew maintained careful personal space. Movement was orderly. Quiet was respected. The Times Leviathan Times was not quiet. From somewhere deep in the ship came the sound of music. Not one kind of music, multiple kinds, bleeding out from different compartments. A heavy drumming from the crew deck. Something with strings from the engineering bay. A human voice singing something slow and low from behind a door marked Times Cape of Storms Maintenance Corridor 7. Riel stopped in front of that door and read the name again. He pulled out his pad and walked to find Lieutenant Emre Aslan, who had been assigned as his escort. Aslan was the ship's executive officer, second in command. He was a compact man with dark hair, a short beard, and an expression that suggested he found almost everything at least a little bit funny. He was eating something from a small container and reading a report at the same time. "Your maintenance corridors have names," Riel said. Aslan looked up. "Yeah. Why?" Aslan chewed, swallowed, looked at the ceiling like he was considering whether the question deserved a long answer or a short one. "A ship you know by name, you fight for," he said. "A ship with no name is just metal. The corridors are not the ship. They are internal passages. They're part of her," Aslan said, with the certainty of someone stating that water was wet. He offered Riel the container. Riel declined. Aslan kept walking. Riel followed him through the Times Leviathan, making notes. What he saw unsettled him in ways he could not fully explain in his reports. The crew, all 240 of them, did not behave the way he expected military personnel to behave. They were disciplined when the job required it. Yes, but in the spaces between duties, they laughed loudly. They told each other stories. They argued about food and sports, and the correct way to calibrate a drive coil, sometimes all at once. One crew member had a small plant growing in a jar beside her workstation. Another had pinned a child's drawing to the inside of his locker door. A photograph of a coastline hung in the wardroom. Dark water, gray sky, white foam on rocks. Aslan caught Riel looking at it. "Black Sea," Aslan said. "Earth. My grandmother's village was 2 kilometers from that water. You have never been there," Riel guessed. Aslan had been born on one of the orbital stations. "No," Aslan said. "But I know what it looks like." That night, Riel sat in his assigned bunk and composed a message to Counselor Thren. He described what he had seen. He said he was not sure how to categorize it. He said the crew seemed almost casual about the fact that they were flying toward an enemy that had not been stopped in 20 years. Thren's reply came 6 hours later, along with a very large attached file. The message said only, "Read the attached. All of it. Then look at the crew again." The file was the same research Thren had been doing since the Times Leviathan Times docked. Earth naval history, wooden ships, salt water, names. Riel read it slowly, in the dark, while the ship moved through space and the music from the crew deck filtered through the walls. Meanwhile, in the command room, Commander Okafor was doing what she did every night before a fight. She read the intelligence reports. She read them again. She set them down, and she looked at the star charts, and she thought not about winning, not yet, but about the shape of the problem. The Vorkai were not stupid. They had beaten Concordat fleets over and over because the Concordat fought in straight lines, in formations, following plans that everyone agreed to before the shooting started. The Vorkai had learned those plans. They had studied them until the Concordat's tactics were as predictable as a clock. You could not outthink a clock, but you could throw it against a wall. The intelligence briefings said 3 Vorkai dreadnoughts. The Times Leviathan Times was not a dreadnought. Neither were any of the 4 Concordat escorts. By weight and firepower, it was not a fair fight. Okafor had been in unfair fights before. She had been at Mars when the orbital platforms fell, and the remaining ships had to make do with what they had. She had been in places where the correct response, according to every tactical manual she had been taught, was retreat. She had retreated exactly once in her career. The experience had left a specific kind of mark on her, not trauma, but something more like a permanent reminder. She had learned what happened to the people you left behind when you retreated. She had not retreated since. She marked 3 positions on the star chart, made a small note beside each one. Then she closed the chart and went to sleep, because a commander who was tired was a commander who hesitated, and hesitation out here was just dying slowly instead of fast. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the third day. There was no quiet moment of arrival, no time to take in the view. The Keth colony hung in the darkness below them, a small world with a thin blue atmosphere and 3 million people on it. Or there had been 3 million. The fires on the surface were visible from space, and above it, moving in slow, patient circles like something that had all the time it needed, were the 3 Vorkai dreadnoughts. They were enormous, black and angular, covered in weapons arrays that looked like spines. The Vorkai had designed them to look like predators on purpose, to feel inevitable, to make the enemy's stomach drop before the first shot was fired. Riel looked at them through the observation port, and his stomach dropped exactly as intended. Then he looked at Okafor. She was standing at the command console, looking at the same ships. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her face was the same as it always was, still and present, and giving away nothing. She pressed the ship-wide communicator. "All stations," she said. "Battle ready. We're going to work. Not times we're going to fight. Not times prepare for combat. Work." Like it was something she had done before, and would do again, and which had a beginning and a middle and an end, like all jobs do. Riel pressed his back against the wall and gripped the safety rail. He thought about the corridors with names. The photograph of the sea. The music still faintly audible even now, though it stopped a moment later when the battle station's tone sounded. He thought about sailors. He looked at the Vorkai dreadnoughts. Then he thought just briefly, just for a moment, that he might actually be more afraid for the Vorkai than for himself. He was not sure why he thought that yet. He would understand soon enough. The Concordat ships moved into formation the moment the Vorkai were spotted. It was a good formation. Clean lines, overlapping fields of fire, each ship covering the one beside it. Riel had seen it used before, in training sims, and in real engagements. It was the standard response, the doctrine that every Concordat captain learned before they were ever given a crew. Move together, fight as one unit, present a unified front. The Vorkai knew that formation. They had beaten it 6 times in the last 14 months. The lead dreadnought turned toward the incoming fleet and began its approach. The other 2 spread out to the sides, a 3-point trap that the Concordat fleet had no good answer for. Riel knew what came next. The Concordat ships would attempt a firing pass on the central dreadnought while trying to avoid the flanking ones. The flanking ones would close in. The math would not work out in the Concordat's favor. It never did. Then the times Leviathan times did something that was not in the formation plan. It broke left. Not a small adjustment. Not a tactical drift. The times Leviathan times fired its main drives at full burn and turned hard away from the formation, away from the safety of the group, on a direct heading toward the largest Vorkai dreadnought at an angle that looked, in every way, like a ramming course. Riel grabbed the safety rail with both hands. "Commander," he started. "Hold on," Okafor said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the main screen, one hand on the console, and her eyes had a focused, narrow quality that Riel had not seen in them before. Not panic, not excitement. Something quieter than either. Concentration. The way a surgeon concentrates deep and clean and not interested in the feelings of anyone in the room. The times Leviathan, times accelerated. On the Vorkai dreadnought's bridge, war speaker Gazek watched the human ship come at him and felt something unusual. He was not sure what to call it yet. Gazek had commanded warships for 30 years. He had fought dozens of species, and he had never lost a major engagement. He understood how enemies behaved. They protected themselves. They made sensible choices. Even brave enemies made sensible choices. They attacked at angles, at range, with some plan that preserved their own existence. Nothing about this was sensible. "They are on a collision course," his sensor officer said. "Yes," Gazek said. "Move to." He did not finish the sentence fast enough. At the last moment, close enough that the times Leviathan's times hull cameras could see the weapon arrays on the dreadnought's side, the human ship rolled. A full rotation on its long axis, A move that should have been physically dangerous at that speed. A move that put enormous stress on the frame and the crew inside it. A move that no rational captain would attempt, because the risk of structural failure was too high. The Leviathan did it anyway. As it rolled, every weapon on its port side fired simultaneously. Railguns, point defense cannons, 2 short-range torpedo tubes, all of it, at once, directly into the underside of the dreadnought, the part that was turned toward them because of the roll, the part that had lighter armor, the part that no one ever attacked, because getting to it required doing what the Leviathan had just done. The explosions lit up the dark like a small sun being born. The dreadnought did not die. It was too large for that. But it lurched sideways from the impacts, its ventral weapons array destroyed, 2 of its engine pods, dark and venting gas into space. It was crippled. Inside the Leviathan, Riel was on the floor. He did not remember falling. His head rang. Around him, crew members were pulling themselves back to stations, checking screens, reporting damage in the calm, rapid shorthand that he had been hearing since he came aboard and had never fully understood until now. Starboard frame 3 has a stress fracture, someone called. Sealing it, someone else responded. Port gun 2 is offline. Switching to manual on gun 3. Commander, secondary coolant is running hot. Noted, Okafor said, from her console. She had not fallen. She was standing, one hand still on the rail, looking at the damage reports with the same expression she had brought to the battle. Steady, present, working. Damage is acceptable. What's the status on the dreadnought? Crippled, venting, not dead. Good enough for now. Watch the flankers. Riel got back to his feet. He looked at the main screen. The 2 flanking dreadnoughts had broken their approach pattern. One had pulled back not in retreat, but in confusion. Its captain had no tactical data for what had just happened. There was no protocol for an enemy that charged head-on and then rolled at point-blank range. It was not a tactic. It was not in any manual. It was something else entirely. Aslan, at the navigation console, was grinning. He called out, "Cape roll, nice and clean, Commander. Don't name it after me," Okafor said. Too late. The Concordat escorts, seeing the largest dreadnought, suddenly crippled, and the formation broken, adjusted. Not with the same aggression, but they were competent ships with competent crews, and they knew how to press an advantage. The second dreadnought found itself engaged by 3 Concordat vessels at once. The Leviathan turned toward the third Gazik's ship. What followed was not a clean battle. It was not the kind of engagement Riel had ever trained to observe or report. There was no formation anymore. No coordinated plan, just ships and weapons, and the constant noise of the crew making decisions at a speed that Riel found hard to follow. He watched crew members he had spoken to over meals, and in corridors work with an intensity that seemed almost separate from fear. A young engineer fixed a power coupling with her bare hands. The secondary gloves were missing. There was no time. She did it anyway. An older technician in the weapons bay worked with a bleeding cut above his eye, because there was no one free to patch it yet, and the guns needed to keep firing. Nobody panicked. Not once. They cursed. They shouted. They made quick decisions, got it wrong, corrected, and moved on. It was loud and messy and full of small failures that were fixed and forgotten in the same breath. And through all of it, Okafor's voice came over the comms, not commanding every action, because there were too many actions for any one person to command but present. Steady. A fixed point in the noise. The smallest Vorkai ship pulled back, just turned and burned away from the fight. Riel watched it go. He had never seen a Vorkai vessel retreat. He was not sure any Concordat officer had. The Concordat escorts finished the second dreadnought, not destroying it, but forcing it into a full defense posture, its offensive capability gone. Which left Gazik. His flagship was the most powerful ship in the engagement. It was still largely undamaged. It had been watching the fight with the cold patience of something that did not need to hurry. And now, with the other 2 dreadnoughts out of the picture, it turned its full attention to the Leviathan. The hits came hard and fast. The Leviathan shook. Lights in the corridors cut out and came back on at half brightness. One of the engines went down, then another. "We are losing drive capacity," the navigation officer reported. I know, Okafor said. Commander, we cannot maneuver at this power level. We are… I know, she said again. Quiet. Firm. Another hit. Riel fell again, caught himself this time. He looked at Okafor, and he asked the question that was tearing through him, the one he could not keep inside any longer. Commander, why are you not afraid? She did not answer right away. The ship groaned around them. Another alarm. Another report. More damage. More corrections. Aslan's voice reading coordinates he could barely hear. Then Okafor's hand went up. Slowly. She pressed the ship-wide communicator. All stop, she said. Cut the drives. Let them come to us. The Times Leviathan Times went still in the dark. Outside, Gazik's flagship slowed. Then it turned. And it began its approach. Riel stared at Okafor. She finally turned to look at him. And something in her face had changed, or maybe he was finally seeing it clearly for the first time. It was not fearlessness. It was older than that. It was the face of someone who had already made peace with every bad outcome, and was still here, still working, because the job was not done. I am afraid, she said simply. I'm always afraid. Then she turned back to the screen and waited for Gazek to come closer. The Times Leviathan Times drifted. Its engines were dark. Its lights were low. From the outside, it probably looked finished, a damaged ship running out of options, settling into the quiet before the end. Gazek's flagship moved toward it in a slow, deliberate line, its weapons charged, taking its time. Inside, it was the opposite of quiet. Every crew member who was not on a critical station was doing something with their hands, sealing fractures, rerouting power, pulling damaged panels apart, and reworking what was inside them. The ship hummed with the sound of 230 people, refusing to accept the situation they were in. Not because they had been ordered to keep working, because they knew no other way. Riel stood near the command console and tried to stay out of the way. He had asked Okafor why she was not afraid. She had told him she was always afraid. That answer had stopped him completely, because it did not fit any category of bravery he had ever understood. On his world, courage meant the absence of fear. A soldier who felt fear was expected to master it, push it down, move past it. You did not admit to fear. You certainly did not carry it with you into a fight. I am always afraid, she had said. Present tense. Active. Not something she had overcome. Something she lived with. He needed to understand that before the end of this. Commander, he said. Tell me about the name. She glanced at him. She was watching the screen. Gazek's ship was still 3 minutes out. She had 3 minutes. She seemed to decide. That was enough. The Leviathan, she said, is not a ship, not originally. It is a word from very old human writing, older than most of our nations, older than our first ships. It is the name for the sea itself, not the surface of it. The deep part, the dark part, the part that swallowed men whole and gave nothing back. Riel listened. Early sailors? She continued, and her voice shifted, barely, into something slower and more careful. The way people speak when they are telling something that matters to them did not know what was in the ocean. They only knew that it was enormous, and they were small, and that it killed people they knew. Their boats were made of wood. You could take a boat like that apart with your hands if you were strong enough. And they sailed those boats into water that no one had ever crossed, with no maps, no certainty, no guarantee of anything. Just the wind and the hope that there was something on the other side worth finding. Aslan was listening too, from his station. He did not look away from his screens, but Riel could tell. And they named their ships, Okafor said, after monsters, after the things that killed them, after the ocean that they were afraid of. She paused, not because they were not afraid of it, but because they wanted the ocean to know, and themselves to know, that they were going anyway. Riel thought about that. The name is a declaration, he said slowly. It is, she said. We are not the biggest thing out here. We know that. We have known it since the first time a wave broke over the side of a wooden boat, and a man in it looked at the water and thought, it is going to try to kill me today. We know fear. We have known it for 10,000 years. It is not new to us. She looked at the screen. Gazek's ship was closer now. We just never let it be the reason we stopped. Riel stood still. He felt something move through him that he did not have a word for in his language. It was not quite admiration. It was not quite grief. It was something between the two, the feeling of understanding something for the first time that had been in front of you all along. He looked around the ship. At the engineer, with the burned hands. At the technician, with the dried blood above his eye. Back at his station, working. At Aslan, sitting at his console, calm and certain, a photograph of a sea he had never swum in somewhere in his locker. At all of them, these strange, warm, noisy, relentless creatures who had come out here in metal boats and named them after the things they feared. At Threshold 9, Counselor Thren had been watching. He had access to the battle feed through the Concordat emergency network, the same feed that was being broadcast to every station, every fleet, every diplomatic office in the Concordat. He had watched the Cape roll. He had watched the second dreadnought fall. He had watched the Times Leviathan times go dark and drift and not die. He had also been transmitting quietly, steadily, without announcement, the battle footage to every species network he had access to. He wanted them to see. He wanted them all to see, because he understood now what he was looking at, and he did not think the Concordat had ever truly understood it before. On dozens of worlds and stations, beings who had heard of humans, but never thought much about them, were watching a battered human ship sit still in the dark, while the most powerful remaining enemy vessel in the engagement came to finish it. They were all wondering the same thing. Why wasn't it running? On his flagship, Gazek had the same question. His tactical officers had run the numbers. The human ship had minimal engine power. Its weapons were partially offline. It could not maneuver. It could not escape. By every measure, it should be doing whatever small maneuvering it could manage to delay the end. That was what rational opponents did. You fought for time even when you knew you had run out of it. The Times Leviathan Times was not fighting for time. It was waiting. Slow our approach, Gazek said. War speaker? Slow it, he said again. I want to be certain. He was not certain. That was the truth of it. Something about this was wrong in a way he could not identify. He had been in hundreds of engagements. He knew what a defeated ship looked like. It looked like the Times Leviathan times dark, damaged, drifting, alone. And yet he slowed the approach, because there was something about that ship that made the part of him that had kept him alive for 30 years say, quietly but clearly, be careful. He brought his ship to within point-blank range, close enough that on the battle cameras, you could see the hull of the Times Leviathan, times the scratches and old burns, the patches over old damage, the massive painted image of the creature along the nose, the long body, the open mouth, the teeth. Gazek stared at it. Prepare final, he began. The Times Leviathan times fired. Not the railguns. Not the point defense cannons. Something else. Something that had not fired once in the entire engagement. Something so deep in the ship's profile that it had not even appeared in the Vorkai's intelligence files. A mass driver. A single, massive accelerator that ran the full length of the Times, Leviathan's Times core, held in reserve, powered slowly and quietly through the entire battle by every system that had been taken offline, every rerouted circuit, every trick the crew had pulled while the ship pretended to be dying. You did not see it fired. You felt it. The sound hit before the light did. Gazek's flagship came apart across its center. Not an explosion, a separation. The front third sheared away from the back two-thirds, and they drifted in opposite directions, trailing atmosphere and debris and silence. A small emergency pod ejected automatically. Inside it, Gazek tumbled in the dark. He was not badly hurt. The pod had done its job. He would be recovered in a few hours. But he was alone now in a small metal room, surrounded by the wreckage of his fleet, and he was feeling something that took him a long time to name. He had felt fear before. In 30 years of war, he had felt it occasionally, the reasonable fear of an ambush, the fear of bad intelligence, the fear of a mistake, tactical fear, the kind that made you smarter. This was not that. This was the older kind, the animal kind, the kind that did not care about tactics or intelligence, or 30 years of experience, the kind that came from the deepest part of the brain and said, Simply, "That thing is dangerous and I should not have been near it." He stared out the small porthole of the pod at the wreckage around him, and at the Times, Leviathan Times, still dark, still damaged, still drifting but still there. Still there. He thought about the painting on its nose. He thought about the open mouth and the long white teeth. He thought about a name he had dismissed as alien decoration when his intelligence officers had first briefed him on the human vessel. He pressed his forehead against the cold porthole glass. For the first time in his career, he was grateful to be a prisoner. The Times, Leviathan Times, came home under tow. One of the concorded escorts the Times measured resolve times, attached a cable, and pulled it the last half day of travel back to Threshold 9. Because the Times, Leviathan's Times, engines could manage about 30% thrust, and Okafor had decided that the crew needed rest more than they needed to limp in on their own power. There would be time for pride later. Right now, hot meals and sleep were the better command decision. Nobody argued with her. Word had spread before they arrived. The battle footage which Counselor Thren had been transmitting from the moment it started had reached every corner of the Concordat network. Beings who had watched it did not have a single shared reaction. Some of them had felt something close to terror, watching the Times Leviathan Times charge a dreadnought 4 times its weight. Some had felt what might be described as excitement, a feeling they did not expect, and that several of them later wrote about at length. Some had felt confused, and then watched the footage again, and felt confused in a different way. But when the Times Leviathan Times docked at Threshold 9, every species on the station turned out to watch. The docking bays were quiet when the ship came in. Quiet in the way that a room full of people is quiet when all of them are thinking the same thing at the same time and none of them have found the words yet. Crew members from a dozen different ships stood in observation windows and corridors and along the rail of the upper dock. Velhari officers. Dokoth engineers. A full delegation of Mirren researchers who had stopped their work entirely, which almost never happened. And then slowly, starting from somewhere near the back of the crowd, the knocking began. Fists against walls, palms against metal. The sound built up and spread through the whole docking ring until it was everywhere. A low, continuous sound like a slow tide. Riel, standing at the Times Leviathan's Times airlock, recognized the gesture. It was very old in Velhari culture, older than the Concordat. It went back to the time before space travel, when Velhari soldiers returning from difficult campaigns were honored not with words because words could be cheap, but with this. The sound that meant, "We were not there, but we saw, and we see you now." Riel had never made that sound for anyone who was not Velhari. He was making it now, without quite deciding to. Ambassador Val met Okafor at the end of the docking corridor. He gave the Concordat bow but slower than usual, more deliberate. His bioluminescent skin was lit with a pale gold color that Riel, coming up behind them, recognized as the Velhari expression of something between deep respect and the specific feeling of being wrong about something important for a long time. "Commander Okafor," Val said, "I owe you an honest answer to a question you asked me earlier." Okafor raised an eyebrow. "I didn't ask you a question, Ambassador." "No," he said. "But I asked one of you. About the name. You said the ocean taught you. I logged that as poetic but meaningless." He stopped. "I was wrong." Okafor looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. That was all. She did not make him explain further, or stay in the moment longer than he needed to. She understood, as she always seemed to understand, exactly how much a thing needed to be said. 3 days later, there was a formal concordate session in the main hall of Threshold 9. Every ambassador was present. It was recorded and transmitted. Val spoke for 40 minutes about the need to formally restructure humanity's role in the Concordat fleet. He used careful diplomatic language and referenced 6 different treaties and 3 separate precedents. What he was saying, in the plainest terms, was this: we were wrong about what humans are. We need them at the front. Counselor Thren published his research the same day. He had been working on it for nearly 3 weeks by then. Ever since the night the Times Leviathan Times first docked, and he had stayed in his office reading about wooden boats on salt water. The document was long and careful, and full of citations and cross-references, It covered 10,000 years of human relationship with the ocean, the ships, the names, the losses, the returns. The way humans encoded fear into their tools, not to hide from it, but to carry it forward with them. He titled it, Human Nomenclature and the Predator Mind. The last line of the document read, "They do not name their ships after beasts to threaten us. They name them as a reminder to themselves. The ocean always wins, but the sailor always tries." It became the most read academic document in Concordat history within 1 week. The day after the session, Gazek was brought to Threshold, 9 under guard. He was held in a diplomatic security room comfortable, by any standard. He had been given food and medical care. He was not mistreated in any way. He sat in a chair for most of his first day there, and stared at the wall and thought. On the second day, he asked to speak to Commander Okafor. There was a debate about whether to allow it. Vol thought it was unnecessary. The security officers thought it was a potential risk. Riel, who had been consulted for reasons he was not entirely sure of, said let them talk. They met in a small room with a table and 2 chairs. No weapons. No recording that was Gazek's condition, and Okafor agreed to it without hesitation. Just 2 people who had tried to kill each other 3 days before, sitting across a table in a room with no windows. Gazek looked at her for a long time before he spoke. He was physically larger than her. His people, the Vorkai, were big and angular, and built for a world with higher gravity than Earth. He had scars on his face from old campaigns, the kind of scars that told a story of a long career. By any physical measure, he was more imposing than the small, quiet human woman sitting across from him. He did not feel more imposing. "What are you?" he said. Not as an insult, as a real question. The kind that keeps a person awake at night. Okafor thought about it for a moment. She did not give the easy answer, the proud answer, the kind that was designed to make the other person feel small. She gave the honest one. "We are the ones who named our fear," she said, and sailed toward it anyway. "We have been doing it for 10,000 years. She looked at him steadily. "We are very good at it by now." Gazek said nothing for a while. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He thought about a painted monster on a dark hull, and a ship that lay still and waited while he came to finish it, and the sound the mass driver had made when it fired. "Your people are going to be difficult," he said at last. "Yes," Okafor said. "For a very long time. Probably." She agreed. He nodded slowly. Something in his face settled the way the face of a man settles when he has finally named the thing that has been bothering him, and found that naming it makes it easier to carry. He stood, and he gave her a gesture that Riel, watching through the small observation window, against all the agreed conditions, because he was a historian, and this was important, recognized as a Vorkai gesture of professional acknowledgement. Warrior to warrior. He had never seen a Vorkai give it to anyone who was not Vorkai. Okafor accepted it with a nod. 1 month after the battle, a new human ship was commissioned at the Concordat Orbital Shipyard. It was a joint construction, human engineers and Concordat fabricators, working together on a frame larger than anything either could have built alone. The ceremony was well attended. More beings showed up than had ever come to a ship commissioning before. They filled the observation decks, and the viewing platforms, and the upper galleries, pressing against the glass to see. The ship sat in the dock, clean and new, its weapons gleaming, its hull unmarked except for one thing, the name, in large white letters, Us Kirkraken, and below the name, in slightly smaller letters, that the design team had added at the last minute, and which no one in the oversight committee had objected to, a painting. A creature with long arms, reaching from the dark water. A thing from deep below the surface. Eyes like 2 pale moons. Riel stood in the gallery with Thren beside him. He read the name. He looked at the painting. He thought about everything that had brought him from the moment the Times Leviathan Times docked, its engines loud, its hull scarred, its painted teeth open wide in the dark, to this moment, standing in a room full of beings, from 100 different worlds, all of them watching a new ship take its name. He thought about sailors. He thought about wooden boats and old oceans, and storms that came without warning. He thought about the things humans named to carry with them into the dark. He thought about whoever or whatever that ship was eventually going to be pointed at. And Sub-Commander Riel, calm, careful, bioluminescent Riel, who had spent his career in clean corridors and orderly formations, felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely sorry for an enemy he had never met. The Kier sat in its dock, patient, still, waiting, just like the thing it was named for.